Hey guys, we begin with an empire, one that built highways before digital maps, aqueducts before indoor plumbing, and bureaucracy before instant messaging. The Roman Empire, a civilization so obsessed with efficiency that it conquered half the known world, mostly to improve its water pressure. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. Rome didn't begin as a marvel of civilization. It began as a swampa, glorified campsite full of shepherds, shouting across a river, and yet somehow those same muddy people built an empire so advanced that two millennia later, we're still impressed and a little suspicious. At its height, Rome stretched across continents, commanded oceans, and invented bureaucracy just to document its greatness. It could supply fresh water to millions, dispose of their waste, and then schedule a gladiator match for dessert. No empire before or since has managed to make indoor plumbing and public slaughter look equally glamorous. The secret to Rome's success wasn't divine favor or luck. It was a lethal mix of discipline, paperwork, and relentless competence. Roman engineers didn't dream of flight or philosophy. They dreamed of drainage. These were people who looked at a swamp and thought, let's build a city here. It'll be hilarious. They had no electricity, no power tools, and not a single tutorial to follow, just geometry, labor, and raw determination. And somehow it worked. Their cities had heated floors, functioning sewage systems, and running water. While much of Europe still treated rain as witchcraft, Rome's genius lay in its obsession with control. If nature didn't cooperate, they bullied it into submission. Mountains were tunneled through, rivers redirected, and deserts crossed just to prove a point. When they said all roads lead to Rome, they meant it because they built them all. But Rome's true technology wasn't just concrete or aqueducts, it was pride. The empire ran on pure, undiluted confidence. Every building was a flex, every invention an insult to anyone still using sticks. Even their ruins seem smug arches, standing tall after earthquakes, whispering, "Still up, are you?" And here's the best part. They achieved all this without electricity, computers, or even a functioning sense of humility. Rome didn't invent everything, it just made everything better, louder, and preferably with columns. If you want to know why Rome lasted so long, don't look at its legions, laws, or gods. Look at its concrete. Because while empires crumble, Roman cement somehow doesn't. The Romans didn't invent concrete, they took the idea, added volcanic ash, and created something indestructible, called opus cementitium. It roughly translates to, "We figured this out before you did." The formula used lime, ash, and seawater to make a material that actually heals itself over time. Modern scientists only rediscovered this property recently, proving that humanity peaked sometime around 120 BCE and has been winging it ever since. This mix allowed Romans to pour entire temples, bridges, and harbors that still stand today. The Pantheon, the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome, hasn't budged in 2,000 years. Meanwhile, modern buildings sometimes collapse if you look at them funny. Roman concrete wasn't just durable, it was artistic. They treated it like magic clay, molding it into arches, domes, and vaults, so elegant that future architects spent centuries trying and failing to replicate them. They didn't hide their engineering behind walls. They showed it off. The message was simple. We could crush you, but we'd rather impress you. They used it everywhere: aqueducts, amphitheaters, baths, even underwater harbors. The Portus Cosenus, built with Roman marine concrete, still survives beneath the waves. Laughing, of course. Not everyone was impressed. Greek purists sneered at its rough texture and called it ugly. But the Romans didn't care. They were too busy reshaping the world. Concrete wasn't art, it was power you could build with. And that's the beauty of Roman innovation. They didn't just build monuments, they built permanence. The empire fell, the emperors vanished, but their walls refused to. In the end, the real mystery isn't how Roman concrete worked, it's how the rest of us forgot. 2,000 years later, we still pour weaker cement, build uglier structures, and call it progress. The Romans would have called it incompetence if Roman concrete was the muscle of the empire. Aqueducts were the veins carrying life, luxury, and the occasional dead rat straight into the heart of civilization. Before Rome, most cities fetched water from rivers or wells, a charming but unhygienic system that often ended in dysentery. The Romans looked at that and said, "No thanks." Instead, they built 260 miles of gravity-powered waterways that delivered fresh water to over 1 million people. No pumps, no motors, just math, arrogance, and perfect angles. Each aqueduct was a masterpiece of precision. Engineers calculated gradients so subtle that water could flow for 50 miles without spilling a drop. They tunneled through mountains, built stone arches across valleys, and ensured the water arrived with just enough pressure to make a public fountain dramatically unnecessary but morally satisfying. And yes, they used lead pipes, which might explain why later emperors thought marrying horses or declaring themselves gods was a good idea. Toxicity aside, the system worked flawlessly. Water flowed into homes, baths, gardens, and fountains built purely to say, "We're cleaner than you." Rome had over 11 aqueducts, each named with the same pomp as a luxury brand. Aqua Marcia, Aqua Claudia, Aqua Virgo, the Eiffel Tower of antiquity. The Aqua Appia, their first, was built in 312 BCE and still functions today. Meanwhile, some modern cities can't keep a water main running for 5 years without issuing public apologies at its peak. The system delivered 200 million gallons of water per dynoff to fill 300 Olympic pools. If Rome had cared about sports that didn't end in bloodshed, public baths stayed open all day. Fountains gushed for aesthetic dominance. Even the poorest citizen could enjoy a rinse that didn't involve a muddy puddle. For the Romans, plumbing wasn't a luxury, it was civilization. They believed running water separated humans from animals. Ironically, most of Europe would forget that belief for the next 1,000 years. Rome didn't just master water, it mastered convenience. And that, more than any conquest or battle, is why its empire still echoes today. Because no one remembers the general who won a war, but everyone remembers the people who built the plumbing. If there's one thing the Romans couldn't stand, it was filth, or, at least, other people's filth. Their cities were loud, crowded, and full of questionable street food, but somehow clean. Rome managed to do what most medieval cities never did. It figured out how to handle human waste without letting it handle them. The heart of this genius was the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's first sewer systems. Built around the 6th century BCE, it started as a drainage canal and evolved into a subterranean labyrinth that still carries water today, which is impressive. If you ignore what kind of water it's carrying, the Cloaca Maxima collected runoff from streets, bathhouses, and latrines, funneling everything into the Tiber River, where, true to Roman forms, someone probably still fished. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the city from drowning in its own civilization. The medieval world wouldn't rediscover this concept for 1,000 years, choosing instead to throw waste out windows and hope for a strong breeze. Romans were fanatical about public hygiene. They had public baths in every city, enormous complexes, with heated pools, steam rooms, and gymnasiums. Everyone from senators to slaves could bathe daily, gossip, and debate politics, while sitting naked in a room full of steam and ambition. Even the toilets were communal, long marble benches with holes, no stalls, and a shared sponge on a stick. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. The Romans didn't fear germs because they didn't know what germs were, yet somehow they still lived cleaner than most 14th century kings. And here's the kicker: they turned sanitation into propaganda. Aqueducts, sewers, and baths weren't just civic utilities, they were proof of moral superiority. Cleanliness meant civilization. Dirt meant barbarism. When Romans looked at conquered territories, they didn't just see enemies, they saw people who still used buckets. In short, Rome was the first society to realize that infrastructure is image. The empire ran on two things: water pressure and pride. And while the emperors may have been insane, at least their cities smelled better than history usually does. If Roman concrete was the skeleton and aqueducts the veins, then their roads were the arteries, and Rome had a lot of blood to pump. The empire built over 250,000 miles of roads stretching from the sands of Egypt to the fog of Britain. That's enough to circle the earth 10 times, which, knowing the Romans, they probably would have tried just to prove a point. These weren't lazy dirt paths. Roman roads were military-grade infrastructure layered with gravel, stone, and metaphorically the crushed bones of anyone who complained about the workload. Engineers planned every slope and curve with mathematical precision because a Roman hated nothing more than inefficiency, except maybe the Gauls. They didn't just build roads to travel, they built them to control. Roads moved armies, taxes, and gossip at terrifying speed. A message could travel from Gaul to Rome in a matter of days, assuming the messenger didn't get mugged. Which street? If the roads were Rome's arteries, then its courier system was the empire's fast, reliable, and occasionally intercepted by barbarians. Rome knew an empire wasn't conquered by swords, it was maintained by communication. Orders had to move faster than rebellions. So they built the cursus publicus, a state-run postal service created by Augustus, who apparently wanted to read bad news faster. This was no casual mail system. It was a logistical masterpiece, complete with relay stations, horses, and bureaucrats, who probably slept in spreadsheets. Couriers carried wax tablets, scrolls, and imperial decrees across thousands of miles, changing horses at way stations called mutations. The rich could send messages across the empire in mere days, which was great. Unless those messages were tax bills. Each courier wore an official badge, the ancient equivalent of a government email signature. They rode day and night, swapping horses at every stop, their only real hazards: exhaustion, robbery, or accidentally delivering a death sentence to the wrong villa. The system's efficiency bordered on terrifying. The emperor could send a command from Rome to Egypt in less than a week. Rebels barely had time to declare independence before receiving a polite note reminding them they were, in fact, still property. And because Rome loved control, they built maps, intricate, scroll-like road charts showing every route, town, and way station. The most famous, the Tabula Peutingera, looks like a cosmic spaghetti diagram of the known world. It's basically Google Maps for people in sandals. But this wasn't a public service. Ordinary Romans didn't get to mail love letters or grandma's sandals across the empire. The cursus publicus was for official business only: military orders, tax records, and the emperor's daily micromanagement. If you were a civilian, your best bet was handing your message to a friend and hoping they didn't die en route. Still, for its time, it was miraculous. Rome had built the world's first high-speed information network, powered by horses and human endurance. Messages crossed continents, empires stayed in sync, and history's largest bureaucracy kept humming. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And in Rome, that was the highest form of beauty. Roman architecture wasn't just functional, it was propaganda carved in stone. Every dome, column, and arch screamed, "We are better than you, and we can prove it mathematically." The Romans didn't build small. They built monuments, the kind of public works that made conquered nations forget they were conquered. At least until the tax bill arrived. Their buildings weren't just shelters, they were statements. The Colosseum, for example, could seat over 50,000 people, had retractable awnings, elevators powered by slaves, and better crowd control than modern concert hall, so people could watch tigers eat accountants. Then there was the Pantheon, which looks like the gods themselves designed it on a good day. Its concrete dome remains the largest unreinforced dome in the world, because apparently rebar was for cowards. The oculus at the top, that perfect circular hole, wasn't just an architectural feature, it was a flex. Light streamed through it like divine approval, illuminating the empire's greatest achievement, its own ego. Roman architects didn't just master symmetry, they weaponized it. They used arches and vaults, not only for strength, but for beauty. Arches made aqueducts possible, bridges eternal, and temples impervious to time. They didn't decorate their structures with art, they made the structure itself the art. And let's talk about scale. Romans loved making you feel small. Entering a basilica or bathhouse wasn't relaxing, it was humbling. The buildings dwarfed everyone, reminding citizens that Rome was infinite and they, statistically speaking, were not. Even the floor mosaics were designed to look up at you with quiet judgment. Everything in Roman architecture was perfectly balanced between utility and showmanship. The engineering was flawless, but so was the marketing. Every structure said, "We built this for you, but also to make you feel unworthy." And perhaps that's the genius of it all. The Romans built not just to last, but to outlast too. Remind the future that while empires fall, smug architecture doesn't. Today, tourists line up to admire ruins that refuse to die. And somewhere deep in the dust, you can almost hear an ancient architect whisper, "You're welcome." Rome's greatest innovation wasn't the sword or even concrete, it was geometry with attitude. The arch turned the impossible into architecture. Before Rome, everyone built flat things, flat walls, flat ceilings, flat roofs that collapsed the moment Zeus sneezed. Then came the Romans, who looked at gravity and said, no. The Roman arch redistributed weight so perfectly that it let them build aqueducts, bridges, and stadiums that refused to fall even when empires did. Every curve, every keystone, every brick whispered a kind of smug mathematical poetry. The arch didn't just hold the structure, it held the empire together. And then there were the vaults arches in series. When one arch wasn't enough, the Romans cloned it across a ceiling and called it a day. The barrel vault, the groin vault, the cross vault, all elegant names for what was essentially ancient structural flexing. They used them in baths, temples, and basilicas because they needed to, but because they could. The Colosseum alone contains 240 arches stacked in tiers like an engineering wedding cake. Every arch perfectly balanced tension and compression, distributing weight down to the foundations. Modern architects still study it and secretly cry. But Rome didn't stop at physics. It made arches beautiful. You couldn't walk 10 feet in a Roman city without passing one named after a guy who probably didn't deserve it. Triumphal arches were the empire's version of a press release. We won something. Here's a giant reminder. The Arch of Titus, for instance, celebrates the destruction of Jerusalem in glorious stonework. Nothing says, please admire our empire like immortalizing someone else's tragedy in marble. And that's the thing. The Romans didn't just master gravity, they humiliated it. Their architecture wasn't about surviving nature, it was about outsmarting it in public, with style. 2,000 years later, their arches still stand, unbothered, while glass skyscrapers crack under the first mild earthquake. The Romans may have fallen to politics, plague, and bad leadership, but their geometry remains undefeated. The Romans didn't just build with water, they worked it. Where other civilizations saw rivers as scenic hazards, Rome saw a power source that never needed lunch breaks. They turned flowing water into labor and in true Roman style. They did it on an industrial scale. The empire's engineers developed water mills, hydraulic saws, and grain factories that could feed entire cities. At places like the Barbegal Mill Complex in southern France, 16 massive water wheels worked in perfect harmony, the ancient equivalent of a food processing plant, minus the health code violations. It's often called the world's first industrial site, which is both impressive and slightly depressing if you've ever waited for your toaster to break down. Their ingenuity didn't stop at grain. They built hydraulic-powered stone saws for cutting marble, water-lifting devices for irrigation, and mechanical pumps to drain mines. If you think Roman engineer sounds dull, remember, these people were moving entire rivers just to make bread faster. And yes, it was all powered by gravity, the quiet, invisible slave that kept the empire running. No electricity, no fossil fuels, no sustainability initiatives, just pure, ruthless practicality. Water went in one way, power came out the other, simple, beautiful, and completely terrifying in scale. Their hydraulic mastery even reached into entertainment. The Colosseum had an underground system capable of flooding the arena for mock naval battles because, apparently, Watching real ships sink inside a sports venue was the ancient version of special effects. Thousands of gallons of water, in and out on commando for spectacle. What's remarkable is how much of it still works. The ruins of Barbagal still whisper with the outlines of channels and sluices, like the ghosts of engineers who never clocked out. 2,000 years later, we still can't decide whether the Romans were geniuses or maniacs. But one thing's clear: they built an empire not just on conquest, but on motion. Water flowed, gears turned, cities fed, and history quietly admitted defeat. Rome didn't just control nature, it employed it, and it never even had to give it a day off. The Romans didn't just conquer the world, they wanted to live comfortably while doing it. After all, what's the point of empire if your marble villa feels like a refrigerator? Enter the hypochondriac version of central heating, invented to millennia before anyone else thought to complain about drafts. The system was simple genius: a furnace beneath the floor, channels that carried hot air through hollow bricks, and flues that vented it through the walls. The result? Heated floors, warm baths, and smug satisfaction. Rich Romans could stroll barefoot in January, while northern barbarians were still defrosting by firelight. Public bathhouses ran on the same principle, but on an industrial scale. The baths of Caracalla, for example, could host thousands at once, each enjoying perfectly regulated heat in massive vaulted halls. Beneath it all, hundreds of slaves shoveled wood into roaring furnaces. Efficiency, Roman style. Luxury for the few, cardio for the many. Even their plumbing was advanced. Hot, cold, and tepid water flowed through pipes and fountains, making Roman spas the envy of the world, and occasionally a death trap when the lead content got a little too ambitious. Still, no one could argue with the comfort, and they didn't stop at heating. In the roaring heart of Constantinople, a city that never slept, always schemed, and judged without mercy, a girl named Theodora first learned what survival truly meant. Born around the year 500 CE to a bear keeper at the Hippodrome, her early life bore no trace of royalty. Her father's role involved managing half-tamed beasts for public spectacle, and when he died, the family's fragile security vanished with him. Left with 3 daughters and no prospects, her mother did what countless desperate Byzantine women had done before. She turned to the theater, but the theater of Constantinople was no genteel salon of polite applause and philosophical debate. It was the empire's pulsing underbelly, a chaotic blend of comedy, dance, satire, and seduction. Performers were both adored and scorned in equal measure. Men came to watch, laugh, and gossip, all while pretending they weren't utterly captivated by the women who commanded the stage. Theodora entered this world as a child, small, sharp-tongued, and already learning that beauty alone would never be enough. She danced, mimed, and acted in plays that mocked the powerful and titillated the crowds. Some called her a courtesan before she even reached her teens. Others hailed her as a genius of performance. What everyone agreed on was her presence. When Theodora walked into a room, the air shifted. Even her enemies noticed. Her routines were scandalous by the standards of her time, filled with bold gestures and biting humor aimed squarely at the elite. She mocked politicians and priests with the same smirk she used on lovers. Yet beneath the glitter and laughter, she saw the cruel chasm between the powerful and the powerless. Theodora may have been forced to entertain the upper class. But she never forgot that she wasn't one of them. By her late teens, she was infamous across the empire, praised for her beauty, condemned for her audacity. Aristocrats mocked her in public and sought her in private. She lived in a world where women were ornaments, yet she somehow transformed mockery into magnetism. The girl from the stage wasn't just performing anymore. She was rehearsing for power, and soon all of Constantinople would know her name. Fame, however, is a fickle companion. In Theodora's Constantinople, it could vanish overnight. After a string of messy affairs and rumors that could have filled an entire scroll of scandal, she found herself falling from favor. One powerful man, likely an official or wealthy patron she'd mocked a bit too cleverly, made certain that theater doors closed to her, with little choice and even less money. Theodora left the glittering capital behind and set out for the provinces. Her exile began in Alexandria, the intellectual furnace of the Eastern world, a city of stark contrasts. Monks debated theology in one corner, while dancers performed in the next, and street preachers shouted about sin above the clamor of traders. Here, stripped of her stage and fame, Theodora faced herself. The woman once adored for her beauty was now alone, surviving on wit and scraps. Yet what could have shattered others only sharpened her mind. In Alexandria, she encountered a Christian sect known for its austere teachings, possibly the Monophyides, who believed Christ possessed a single divine nature. Their message of endurance and humility struck her deeply. Theodora, the scandalous performer, began to reflect on redemption, not the meek kind whispered in prayer, but a fierce, self-forged rebirth. She began weaving spirituality into ambition, learning that both could serve her survival. She also grasped something even more valuable. Influence isn't just earned on stage, it's commanded through conviction. Whether in the theater or the church, people followed those who spoke with certainty. And Theodora always how to turn certainty into art. Eventually, she left Alexandria behind, traveling through the deserts of North Africa and Syria, accompanying a wealthy official for a time before parting ways. It was a period of trial and transformation. The gossip columns of Constantinople would later call this her shameful wandering. They couldn't have been more wrong. This was her metamorphosis, the cocoon from which the empress would emerge. By the time Theodora returned to the empire's heart, she was no longer the same dancer who had once performed for coins and applause. She had become something far more dangerous, a woman who had seen the world, learned its hypocrisies, and decided she would never again be at its mercy. When Theodora returned to Constantinople, she carried no gold, no title, and no noble name to shield her, only a quiet fire that unnerved anyone who looked too long. The city hadn't changed much. The same gilded mosaics, the same whispers of sin and sanctity echoing through its marble streets. But she had changed. The once provocative performer was now composed, reflective, and shrewd. She had learned that true power lay not in the applause of the crowd, but in the attention of the few who ruled them, and soon one man in particular would give her that attention. Justin. At the time, Justinian was not yet emperor. He was the brilliant nephew of Emperor Justin the First, ambitious, disciplined, and socially awkward in the way powerful men often are before history romanticizes them. He was a man obsessed with order, law, and destiny. Yet he harbored a curious weakness. He admired strong minds as much as beautiful faces. Theodora somehow embodied both. Legend says Justinian first saw her while she was living modestly in a small house, spinning wool and offering counsel to other women. She was no longer the spectacle of the hippodrome. She was a mystery wrapped in humility, but when she spoke, her words carried the precision of a blade. Justinian was captivated not by her beauty, though it remained undeniable, but by her intellect. She understood people, politics, and the subtle art of making men believe. They'd thought of something first. Their connection was immediate, but scandalous. Byzantine high society sneered. Marrying an ex-actress was unthinkable. Actresses were legally barred from such unions. Yet Justinian wasn't the kind of man to let laws stand in his way. He rewrote them quite literally. A special decree lifted the restriction, allowing him to marry Theodora. It was an unprecedented act of defiance, one that shook the moralists of Constantinople to their perfumed core. When they wed around 525 CE, tongues wagged across the empire. The emperor's nephew has married a courtesan, they said. But the laughter of courtiers died quickly. For the first time in history, a woman once jeered from the stage now walked the marble halls of power not as a mistress, but as a partner, and the empire had no idea what was coming next. In 527 CE, the empire trembled as Emperor Justinold and Ailing officially crowned his nephew Justinian as co-emperor. And at his side, dressed not in stage silk but in imperial purple, stood Theodora. For every senator who clenched his jaw and muttered prayers of disgust, there were 10,000 citizens in the streets, staring, whispering, and wondering how a woman born to a bearkeeper had climbed to the highest throne in the East. Her coronation wasn't just a political act. It was a public declaration that the empire's old rules were being rewritten. Theodora wasn't there by accident or affection. She had earned her place. In every conversation, she matched Justinian's intellect. In every council, she outmaneuvered nobles who underestimated her. When foreign envoys bowed, they weren't sure whether to address her as Augusta or Your Majesty. Theodora made sure they learned both. She quickly became more than a ceremonial consort. While Justinian obsessed over law codes, aqueducts, and tax reforms, Theodora studied people, the real machinery of empire. She read letters from provincial governors, met with church leaders, and even heard petitions from women who had no voice in court. To many, she was a symbol of possibility. To others, a dangerous precedenta, former entertainer wielding imperial authority. It unsettled men who had built their careers on pedigree, not ability. Her influence soon became undeniable. She advised Justinian on everything from diplomacy to domestic reforms, particularly in issues affecting women. Under her counsel, laws were passed protecting women from forced prostitution and granting greater property rights. Theodora, once labeled the empire's shame, had become its unexpected moral reformer. But her power came at a cost. The aristocrats loathed her. Monks whispered that she was Jezebel reborn. Chroniclers, like Procopius, wrote scandalous secret histories, claiming she still possessed the soul of a seductress. Yet the woman they mocked behind closed doors was the same one standing beside the most powerful man in the world, calm, composed, and untouchable. By the time Justinian officially ascended as sole emperor later that year, Theodora was not merely his empress. She was his equal, the sharp mind behind the golden throne. The streets that once echoed with her laughter now echoed with her legend. It began, as revolutions often do, with entertainment gone wrong. In January of 530 to CE, the Hippodrome, the same arena where Theodora's father had once kept bears, and she herself had danced, erupted in fury. The rival chariot teams, the Blues and the Greens, had long been more than sports fans. They were political factions with deep loyalties. That day, their chants turned from cheers to war cries. What began as a protest against arrests escalated into 6 days of bloodshed, fire, and rebellion, the infamous Nika Revolt. Senators eager to restore their lost influence secretly sided with the rioters. The mob, tens of thousands strong, roared for Justinian's overthrow and the crowning of a new emperor. The palace shook with the sound of rage outside its walls. Inside, the imperial council descended into panic. Advisors begged. Byzantium burned. Senators eager to restore their lost influence secretly sided with the rioters. The mob, tens of thousands strong, roared for Justinian's overthrow and the crowning of a new emperor. The palace shook with the sound of rage outside its walls. Inside, the imperial council descended into panic. Advisors begged Justinian to flee, to abandon the capital, the throne, and his dignity. But not Theodora, dressed in purple, the color of royalty and bloodshed, refused to run. She rose before the council, her voice steady amid chaos. "If flight were the only means of safety," she said, "yet I should disdain to fly. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. Purple makes a fine shroud." It was more than courage. It was strategy. Her words snapped Justinian out of hesitation. The emperor, who had nearly fled, regained his resolve. He ordered his generals, Belisarius and Mundus, to storm the Hippodrome. The result was a massacre, 30,000 rebels slaughtered in a single afternoon. The rebellion ended not with diplomacy, but with the echo of swords and the stench of smoke. Theodora's defiance saved the empire that day. Her speech became legendary, taught in every future history of Byzantium. But beyond the rhetoric, it revealed the true nature of her power. She wasn't just Justinian's emotional anchor. She was the spine of the regime. After the revolt, no one dared question her authority again. The courtiers who once whispered behind fans now bowed deeply. The mob that once cheered her downfall had been silenced in their graves. Theodora had proven, in the most brutal way possible, that she was not a survivor of scandal, but the architect of survival itself. When the smoke of the Nika revolt finally cleared, Theodora emerged from the ashes not merely as empress, but as something rarer, a ruler forged in fire. Constantinople lay wounded, its streets charred, its people broken, and its faith in leadership shaken. Yet out of that ruin, Theodora saw opportunity. Justinian rebuilt the city in marble and stone. Theodora rebuilt its conscience. She had never forgotten what it meant to live at the mercy of Menes, a performer, as a woman, as someone dismissed before she even spoke. Now that she had power, she used it ruthlessly in the service of those who had none. She pushed through reforms no emperor before had dared to consider. Women forced into prostitution were granted protection and refuge. Slavery of the desperate was restricted. Husbands who abandoned their wives could be punished. Women could inherit property in their own right. To the elite, these were shocking policies. Soft, they sneered, unfit for empire. But Theodora didn't care about the senators grumbling over their wine. She cared about the women who came to her palace gates at dawn. Seeking justice, she established a house called the Metanoia, repentance, a refuge for former prostitutes, where they could live, work, and start anew. It wasn't charity. It was vengeance, disguised as mercy. Theodora had turned the empire's shame into its strength. Her moral authority, however, was double. Many critics called her reforms hypocrisy, citing her scandalous youth. They missed the point entirely. Theodora's power came precisely because she had lived the life the empire condemned and survived it. Her empathy wasn't theoretical. It was lived experience wrapped in silk. Even Justinian, the great codifier of law, deferred to her insight on social matters. When he revised the empire's legal code, Theodora's influence could be seen in the new protections for women and the poor. Her fingerprints were embedded in the very laws that shaped Byzantine society for centuries. Yet for all her compassion, she was no saint. Theodora's mercy had limits, and her enemies learned that the hard way. For every woman she lifted up, there was a nobleman brought lofen, without realizing, until far too late, that the empress had already written his fate. Power in Byzantium was a performance, and no one understood the stage better than Theodora. But with every bow from a general and every polite smile from a senator came a hidden dagger. The court of Constantinople was a nest of ambition, and Theodora was the brightest, most envied serpent within it. Her rise had humiliated the aristocracy. Noble women who traced their bloodlines to Rome could hardly stomach a former actress commanding their husband's respect. Some pretended loyalty, others whispered poison in corridors heavy with incense. Monks thundered from the pulpit that the empress was the devil in silk. Chroniclers, like Procopius, her most spiteful critic, recorded her as a scheming seductress who used her body as others used the sword. In truth, she was guilty only of doing what every man in that palace did but better. Her intelligence and sharp tongue made her both admired and feared. She was known to humiliate courtiers with a single glance, to freeze a senator mid-sentence with one raised eyebrow. When Justinian faltered in judgment, Theodora made the hard decisions, especially the ones that required no mercy. She played politics like chess, and her opponents never realized they'd been cornered until the board was swept clean. Her rivalry with the general Belisarius's wife, Antonina, was both alliance and war. The two women ruled their husbands as power partners, then turned on each other in bursts of betrayal and reconciliation that left even the gossips exhausted. One day they'd share secrets over wine. The next one would be orchestrating the other's downfall. It was court life at its purest, friendship laced with arsenic. Still, Theodora's sharpest weapon wasn't fear, it was loyalty. Those who served her faithfully were rewarded beyond measure. She raised servants to courtiers, courtiers to governors, women to saints in the eyes of the empire. She built her own network of spies, informants, and loyal clerks, a silent army that answered to no one but her. Behind the jeweled veil, she was always calculating, always watching. Theodora had learned the first rule of power early. Survival depends not on innocence, but on control. And though her enemies seethed in gold and silk, she alone understood that crowns aren't inherited. They're defended one ruthless decision at a time. If politics was Theodora's battlefield, religion was her chessboard. The Byzantine Empire wasn't merely a statehood. Yet, beneath the gold-leaf mosaics and clouds of incense, the empire was split by theological fury. The question tearing the Christian world apart was deceptively simple. Was Christ of one nature or two? To outsiders, it was hair-splitting theology. To Byzantium, it was grounds for civil war. Justinian, ever the legalist, supported the orthodox position that Christ had both a human and divine nature. Theodora, however, quietly championed the monophysites, who believed his nature was singular and divine. It wasn't just belief, it was loyalty. The monophysites had sheltered her during her exile in Alexandria. Now she sheltered them in return. While Justinian debated bishops, Theodora played her own game. She transformed parts of the palace into safe havens for persecuted clergy, smuggling exiled monks back into the city and hosting secret councils under the emperor's very nose. In public, she smiled and nodded during orthodox ceremonies. In private, she sent golden letters to monophysite leaders hiding in deserts and monasteries. It was hypocrisy to some, diplomacy to others, but to Theodora, it was justice. Her maneuvering wasn't just religious, it was strategic. By backing the marginalized sect, she balanced her husband's authority with her own independent network of allies. While Justinian ruled the empire's laws, Theodora ruled its souls. She understood something her husband never fully grasped. Faith could control the masses far more effectively than decrees ever could. But her actions also deepened the chasm between them. Justinian adored her, yet their faiths became quiet rivals. He believed unity lay in doctrine. She believed unity lay in mercy. And though they ruled side by side, they were often two empires within one, his of marble, hers of conviction. Her defiance left a lasting mark. When the Orthodox chroniclers cursed her name, the monophysites remembered her as a saint, their secret empress. Even centuries later, they whispered her story in remote monasteries, calling her the protector of the true faith. In an age where belief could kill you, Theodora had done the unthinkable. She turned heresy into power and compassion into empire. By the mid-540s, Constantinople had changed, and so had Theodora. The grand reconstruction after the Nika revolt had turned the city into a jewel of the world, crowned by the Hagia Sophia, that vast dome floating like heaven's canopy above the skyline. Yet, behind the splendor, plague and exhaustion crept through the empire. Justinian's wars drained its coffers. Disease swept through the capital, and the once vibrant empress began to fade. Theodora had been many things: dancer, exile, queen, reformer. But she had never been fragile. Still, by 548 CE, illness began to tighten its grip. Historians suspect cancer, though the truth is buried with her. Even as her body weakened, her will remained ironclad. She continued to hold court from her bed, issuing commands through loyal attendants, scolding ministers, and refusing pity. She had lived too long, surrounded by weakness, to show any herself. Her final months were marked by an eerie serenity. The woman who once defied riots and theologians alike spent her last days surrounded by the empire she had reshaped. Justinian, broken with grief, visited her daily. To him, she was more than an empress. She had been his shield, his counselor, and his equal. Without her, even the laws he'd written seemed lifeless. He had once rebuilt Constantinople from ashes, but he could not rebuild Theodora. When she finally died at the age of about the sun, she had risen from the filth of the theater to the glory of the throne, wielding beauty, intellect, and audacity like divine weapons. Centuries later, historians still argue whether she was saint or sinner. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in the story of a woman who refused to be forgotten before they became the iron-fisted rulers of the Baltic. The Teutonic Knights were simply a group of German pilgrims with a tent. It was during the siege of Acre, as the Third Crusade ground into dust under the weight of blood and disease. The Holy Land had become a furnace of faith and death. In the chaos, a handful of men from Bremen and Lübeck, German merchants turned crusaders, set up a makeshift hospital beneath white sails stitched from their own ships. Their goal was not conquest, but compassion, to care for their wounded countrymen who had fallen under the burning sun. That humble act would be the spark that lit a much darker fire. What began as a band of healers soon grew into something far more formidable. War has a way of transforming charity into necessity, into power. Within a decade, these German brothers, once devoted to tending the sick, took up arms to defend their hospital. Their compassion hardened into discipline, their faith sharpened into zeal. By 1198, the transformation was complete. With the blessing of Pope Innocent III, the Order of Brothers of the German Hospital of St. Mary in Jerusalem was officially declared a military order, a fusion of monk and soldier. They wore white mantles marked with a stark black cross, a symbol of purity wrapped in menace. Their vows were holy poverty, chastity, obedience, but their purpose had become unmistakably martial. They modeled themselves after the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, but with one crucial difference: they were German. Their language, their organization, their rigid hierarchy reflected the cold precision of the Holy Roman Empire. They were crusaders with a bureaucratic soul, knights who could pray, fight, and file reports with equal discipline. The order's early years were spent defending Christian pilgrims and fortresses in the Holy Land, but Jerusalem was slipping away. The crusading dream was dying in the desert, and the Teutonic Knights knew it. To survive, they would need a new frontier, new Holy Land to conquer. Soon, their eyes turned from the sands of Palestine to the frozen forests of the Baltic. There, amid pagans and snow, their real empire would begin. Discipline was the marrow of the Teutonic Order. To join, one had to abandon not only worldly possessions, but also identity. Upon entry, knights surrendered their names, families, and any hint of personal ambition. In return, they gained a white cloak marked with a black cross, the unmistakable symbol of God's soldiers from the north. Their motto, though never officially written, could have been simple: fight, serve, obey. Life within the order was monastic, rigid, and severe. Each knight took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, ideals that often sounded holier on parchment than they looked in practice. Poverty meant living without personal wealth, though the order itself grew rich from land and spoils. Chastity meant avoiding women, but the frontier was long, the winters longer, and temptation lingered in every pagan village. Obedience, however, was absolute. A knight who questioned his commander did not face debate, he faced expulsion or the sword. The ranks were sharply divided. At the top stood the Grand Master, a mixture of general, priest, and bureaucrat, followed by commanders, priests, and lay brothers who handled logistics, farming, and trade. Even among warriors of noble birth, humility was enforced. A baron might scrub dishes next to a peasant-born squire. Both would eat the same plain meals in silence. Arrogance was the devil's whisper, and the Teutonic Knights prided themselves on deafness. Their castles were not just fortresses, but temples of order. Within their thick stone walls, daily life followed a strict rhythm of prayer, training, and combat readiness. Bells marked the hours of devotion, and every action was considered service to God, from sharpening swords to cleaning armor. Warfare was wholly routine, but beneath this disciplined surface lay contradiction. The order's members believed themselves both monks and conquerors, men of God, wielding steel in his name. They preached humility while erecting castles that towered over Baltic tribes. They vowed purity while baptizing entire regions with fire and blood. In their minds, conquest wasn't greed, was salvation delivered at sword point. This was the paradox of the Teutonic Code: absolute faith fused with absolute control. In their pursuit of divine order, the knights had created something more enduring and far more dangerous than they realized: a holy army that answered to no one but itself. By the early 13th century, the Holy Land was slipping from Christian hands, and the Teutonic Knights knew it. The grand castles of Jerusalem were falling one by one, and the crusading zeal that had once ignited Europe was cooling fast. Yet the Church had a new idea. If the pagans of the East would not come to Christ, then Christ would come to them by sword if necessary. The Baltic, still home to the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians tribes who worshipped forests, fire, and the old gods, became the next holy battlefield. It was Duke Conrad of Masovia, a Polish ruler tormented by raids from the pagan Prussians, who first extended the invitation. He offered the Teutonic Order land along his northern border, a modest region called Kolmerlanden, exchange for protection and the conversion of the pagans for the knights. It was the perfect offer: divine mission, political backing, and a vast wilderness to tame. Pope Honorius III and Emperor Frederick II both sanctioned the expedition. The Teutonic Knights were granted the land they conquered in perpetuity, answering only to the Pope. It was a political loophole so cunning it might have made the devil smile. By 1230, the order had arrived, their white cloaks flashing against the dark forests of Prussia. The natives did not welcome them. They fought fiercely, striking from the trees with ambushes and fire arrows. The Teutonic response was methodical and merciless, the slow grind of discipline against defiance. Villages were razed, idols smashed, temples burned. Pagans who resisted baptism were executed or enslaved. Those who converted often did so with a sword at their neck. But the knights weren't mere brutes. They built fortresses wherever they marched, each one a symbol of permanent conquest. Wooden stockades soon gave way to stone, the most famous being Marienwater and later Marienburg, the beating heart of their rising state. Monks turned masons, and crusaders turned landlords. In the frozen wilderness, the Teutonic Knights found something the Holy Land never offered: permanence. They were no longer guests in a foreign desert, but masters of their own domain. The The Baltic frontier became their new Jerusalem, and the cross now flew over fields that had never known it before. The Northern Crusade had begun. When the Teutonic Knights marched into Prussia, they did not come as visitors. They came as architects of a new world. Between 1230 and 1280, they transformed the wild lands of the Baltic into a fortress state built on both faith and fear. Their white mantles moved like ghosts through forests of birch and pine, their processions echoing with hymns that promised salvation but delivered submission. At first, the Prussians resisted fiercely. They fought as they lived in tribes, bound by kinship and the sacred fires of their gods. They struck from the forests, burning Teutonic outposts and vanishing into the snow. For a time, the knights underestimated them, calling them savages. But those savages knew the land better than any crusader could. They used rivers, marshes, and weather as weapons. Dozens of castles were taken and retaken. Entire Teutonic garrisons vanished overnight. But the knights had something the pagans did not: patience, logistics, and divine paperwork. Each defeat was followed by a reinforcement ship from the west, filled with fresh soldiers, masons, and priests. Every campaign ended with new fortresses rising on the ruins of rebellion. By 1255, the Order's control had expanded north to the Baltic coast, where they founded Kingsburg the Kings, mountain named after King Ottokar II of Bohemia, one of their crusading allies. It was not just a fortress. It was a statement. The Germans had come to stay. The conquest was brutal, even by medieval standards. Pagan leaders were publicly executed, their priests drowned, their shrines torn down and replaced by churches. The Prussians, who converted, often did so under duress, baptized in rivers that still ran red from war. Yet, as the decades passed, resistance dwindled. The knights built roads, farms, and trade posts, turning chaos into a kind of grim order. By the end of the century, Prussia was no longer pagan. It was a Christianized military colony ruled by an order that answered neither to king nor bishop. The Teutonic Knights had achieved what even the Templars never did: a sovereign state forged by the sword and sanctified by Rome. But in their zeal for conquest, they had sown the seeds of future defiance. For while the pagans fell silent, their neighbors Poland and Lithuania were beginning to take notice. Wherever the Teutonic Knights went, castles followed. To them, a fortress was more than a stronghold. It was theology made of stone. Each tower symbolized divine order rising above pagan chaos. From the banks of the Vistula to the icy shores of the Baltic, the Order's engineers carved a new landscape of authority, faith, and fear. Their castles were masterpieces of German efficiency: clean lines, red brick, cold symmetry. They built not for beauty, but for permanence. The most famous of them all, Marienburg. The construction of these fortresses was relentless. Each campaign ended not just with a battle won, but with a foundation laid. In conquered territories, wooden forts gave way to stone keeps. Villages sprouted beneath their walls, homes for settlers from Germany and Poland, craftsmen and merchants who followed the Order's expansion. Every castle was a statement. God is here and he speaks German. But these bastions of piety hid contradictions. Within their walls lived men sworn to purity, yet surrounded by luxury. Their refectories overflowed with meat and imported wine. Their treasuries bulged with tribute from converted villages. The knights called themselves monks of war, but their lives often resembled those of feudal lords. Still, the castles worked militarily and psychologically. Pagans saw them as invincible. Christians saw them as proof that faith could be built with mortar. From Marienwerder to Kingsburg, from Thorn to Ragnet, a network of strongholds spread like a chain of black crosses across the north. They controlled not only the land, but the minds of everyone who lived beneath their shadow. And yet, beneath the piety, ambition stirred. The order had started as servants of God-healers and protectors. Now they were rulers, landlords, and tax collectors. They were becoming what they had once despised, an empire cloaked in holiness. The line between crusade and colonization blurred, and for the first time, the Teutonic Knights began to look less like warriors of Christ and more like kings in armor. By the mid-13th century, the Teutonic Knights had found their true theater of war not in the deserts of Jerusalem, but in the snow-covered forests of the Baltic. What began as the conquest of Prussia expanded into a full-blown holy war known as the Northern Crusades. With papal approval, the order now marched against every tribe that dared cling to the old gods. Livonians, Curonians, and Tyre peoples became enemies of Christ overnight. Each campaign followed a grimly predictable rhythm. The knights would announce a crusade, gather volunteers from across Europe, and descend upon pagan lands in waves of armored piety. Monks blessed their swords, priests promised absolution, and the black cross gleamed like a divine seal of permission. Villages that resisted were burned. Survivors were baptized under the smoke. Conversions came with sermons and the occasional sword point for emphasis. But not all crusades went as planned. The Lithuanians proved stubborn, fierce, and cunning. They were the last great pagan power in Europe, horsemen who could vanish into forests and strike without warning. For every fortress the Teutonic Knights built, the Lithuanians burned too. Campaign after campaign, the frontier bled. The order called it holy war. The Lithuanians called it survival. Still, the knights were patient. They didn't need to win every battle, only to outlast the will to resist. Their network of castles, their disciplined ranks, and their endless supply of crusading volunteers gave them an edge. In time, they subdued most of Livonia and Estonia, absorbing the remnants of other crusader groups like the Sword Brothers. The Baltic frontier became a permanent war zone, a place where faith, fire, and frost met. By the 14th century, the Teutonic Order's banner stretched across the northern coast from Danzig to Narva. They ruled as both priests and princes, their authority backed by Rome and enforced by steel. To the Pope, they were defenders of Christendom. To the people they conquered, they were the apocalypse in armor. The Northern Crusades had made them rich and powerful beyond their founding dreams. But the more they conquered, the further they drifted from the humility of Acker's hospital tents. The Black Cross still stood for faith, but it also cast a long shadow over Europe. By the early 14th century, the Teutonic Order had become more than a brotherhood of knights. It was a stata theocracy with armor. From their colossal headquarters at Marienburg, the Grand Master ruled over vast territories stretching from the Vistula River to the Gulf of Finland. This was not a kingdom of nobles, but a meticulously organized machine of faith and discipline. Every castle was a command center. Every village a cog in the divine engine. The order's government was structured like a monastery with swords. The Grand Master was both emperor and abbot, flanked by a council of high-ranking knights who governed regions known as bailiwicks. Below them were Compter's commanders, who managed individual fortresses, collecting taxes, training troops, and enforcing the order's rigid rules. Even local peasants lived under a kind of holy surveillance, their labor seen as service to God's army. Economically, the order was unmatched. Their disciplined bureaucracy made them the most efficient landlords in Northern Europe. Grain, amber, and furs flowed through their ports, filling their coffers and financing endless wars. The Hanseatic merchants of Lübeck and Danzig flocked to their trade hubs, enriching the order further. Monks might have vowed poverty, but the Teutonic Knights were building cathedrals of wealth. Religiously, they presented themselves as paragons of Christian virtue. Morning prayers, silent meals, and daily masses were mandatory. But beneath that polished surface, temptation simmered. Some knights broke their vows, keeping secret mistresses or drinking heavily in their isolated castles. Others grew obsessed with power, using the order's authority to settle personal vendettas. The purity they preached was becoming an illusion, polished for papal approval. Politically, the order behaved less like humble crusaders and more like an ambitious empire. They founded new towns, imposed German law, and encouraged settlers to colonize the lands of the conquered tribes. Paganism had been crushed. Now came Germanization. Roads, churches, and markets replaced the sacred groves of old. To outsiders, the Teutonic state looked invincible, perfect blend of faith and discipline. But to those within, cracks were forming. The knights had conquered the world they wanted. Now they had to rule it, and ruling required something they had never learned on the battlefield: restraint. Power invites enemies. And by the mid-14th century, the Teutonic Order had more than it could handle. Their brutal expansion into the Baltic had earned them few friends and many grudges. Chief among their rivals were two rising Christian powers, Poland and Lithuania. Lithuania, once proudly pagan, shocked Christendom in 1386 when its Grand Duke Jogala converted to Christianity and married Queen Jadwiga of Poland, creating the Polish-Lithuanian Union. It was a masterstroke of politics. Overnight, the Teutonic Knights lost their favorite excuse for war. The Lithuanians were no longer heathens to be baptized by sword. They were Christians and fellow Europeans who expected peace. But peace was the last thing the Teutonic Order wanted. The knights refused to accept the conversion as genuine, calling it false baptism and accusing Jogila of pretending to be Christian to avoid holy punishment. It was convenient theology and a good pretext for continued conquest. They launched repeated invasions into Lithuanian territory, claiming divine justification while burning villages and enslaving peasants. For years, the borderlands became a battlefield. The knights' shining armor and strict formations clashed with the swift cavalry of the Lithuanians and Poles, crusading volunteers from Germany, France, and England joined the order for holy adventure, while Lithuanian nobles rallied under the Black Handred banner of defiance. The tension culminated in one of the most significant medieval battles, Grunwald or Tannenberg. The Teutonic Knights marched under their Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, confident of victory. they faced a combined Polish-Lithuanian army led by Jogula and Vytautas the Great. The knights disciplined and proud formed their shining ranks on the open field and were annihilated. By the end of the day, the Order's army lay shattered. Ulrich himself was slain, his white mantle trampled in the mud. It was the beginning of the end. Though the Order survived politically, its myth of invincibility had been destroyed. Grunwald was more than a defeat, it was humiliation. For the first time, the Black Cross had been broken not by pagans, but by Christians. And in that irony lay the cruelest twist of all. The Order that once claimed to defend Christendom had finally been undone by it. After the catastrophe at Grunwald in 1410, the Teutonic Order never truly recovered. They limped back to their fortresses, still proud but hollow, their aura of divine invincibility shattered. The once mighty monastic empire began to crumble, not in a single blow, but slowly, like a fortress left to rot from within. The knights still wore their white cloaks and prayed their daily prayers, but their confidence had turned brittle. The Baltic wind that once carried their hymns now carried whispers of failure. The decades that followed were filled with uneasy truces, debts, and rebellions. The Order's treasury, once overflowing with tribute and trade, bled dry from war reparations and the loss of crucial lands. Their subjects, German settlers, Prussians, and Poles, grew restless under their rule. The aura of holiness that once justified the Order's authority was gone, replaced by resentment and taxation. The final blow came from within. In 1525, Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg embraced the winds of the Reformation and did the unthinkable. He abandoned his vows, secularized the Order's territories, and declared himself Duke of Prussia under Polish suzerainty. The Teutonic Order, once a warrior brotherhood bound by purity and obedience, had become a duchy. Its Black Cross was now a mere heraldic memory. The sacred had become political and the monks had become bureaucrats. Yet, despite its fall, the shadow of the Teutonic Order lingered. Their castles Marienburg, Kinsberg, Thorn remained standing, red brick monuments to discipline and dominion. Their statecraft and organization laid the groundwork for Prussia's later rise, a new kind of empire, one forged not in the name of God, but in the name of efficiency and power. The very spirit that had once driven the Teutonic Crusades would centuries later echo in the militarism of the Prussian kings. In the end, the Teutonic Knights were both saints and sinners, builders and destroyers. They brought literacy, law, and trade to the Baltic, but also bloodshed, slavery, and forced conversion. Their Black Cross became a paradox, a symbol of faith corrupted by ambition. When their last true knights died, the Order did not vanish. It simply changed costume. The prayer had ended, but the echo of the crusade still haunted Europe, a reminder that even holy men, given too much power, can become what they once swore to fight. The year was 41 BCE, and the Roman world was bleeding from within. Julius Caesar was dead, the Republic was dying, and three men now ruled what remained: Octavian in Rome, Lepidus in Africa, and Mark Antony in the east. Of the three, Antony was the most brilliant soldier and the most dangerously human. He was impulsive, charming, and reckless, a man who could conquer nations, but not his own desires. It was this flaw, perhaps this gift, that led him straight into the orbit of Cleopatra VII. Queen of Egypt. Their first meeting took place in the city of Tarsus, on the southern coast of modern-day Turkey. Antony had summoned Cleopatra to answer accusations that she had aided his enemies. Most rulers would have arrived humbled, veiled, and afraid, but Cleopatra was not most rulers. She turned a summons into a spectacle. According to legend, she sailed up the Kidnus River in a barge plated with gold, its purple sails billowing under a perfumed breeze. The air shimmered with incense. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, while attendants fanned her with peacock feathers. Musicians played, dancers moved in rhythm, and the curious citizens of Tarsus crowded the banks to witness what felt less like a royal audience and more like a myth unfolding in real time. Antony, who had faced armies and triumphed in countless wars, was unprepared. He expected a nervous queen seeking forgiveness. Instead, he found a woman who commanded the stage better than any general commanded an army. Cleopatra knew the power of presentation, that in a world ruled by men, appearance could be its own kind of weapon. When she finally met Antony, she spoke with confidence and wit, blending flattery with challenge. She treated him not as a conqueror, but as an equal or, perhaps, as prey. By the time the banquet ended, Antony was captivated. Her intellect matched his ambition. Her charm softened his pride. That evening in Tarsus was no mere diplomatic encounter. It was the opening act of one of history's most intoxicating and destructive romances, a union born not of love alone, but of calculation, desire, and the unstoppable magnetism between power and beauty. Cleopatra had conquered Antony long before she touched his hand. Her weapon wasn't beauty alone, it was spectacle. In Egypt, power was theater and Cleopatra was its leading performer. So when she invited Antony to a banquet aboard her gilded barge, she wasn't entertaining him. She was staging a revelation. The night was designed to overwhelm the senses. The decks glowed with lanterns, their light shimmering across the dark waters of the Nile. Musicians played soft flutes in the distance, and servants moved like shadows, carrying trays of jeweled cups and silver platters. Antony, still clad in Roman armor and dust-streaked from campaign, found himself in a world where time seemed to melt away. Cleopatra reclined beside him in silk-dyed Tyrian purpura hue so costly it was reserved for gods and emperors. Every gesture, every word was measured with precision. When she laughed, it wasn't merely charming, it was strategy. The meal itself became legendary. Later accounts claimed Cleopatra hosted 12 banquets, each more extravagant than the last. At one, she famously wagered Antony that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal, and won by dissolving one of her priceless pearls in vinegar and drinking it. Whether true or embellished, the message was unmistakable. While Rome worshipped discipline, Egypt worshipped magnificence. Cleopatra wasn't just wealthy, she was wealth. For Antony, it was irresistible. Egypt offered everything Rome had taken from him: joy, indulgence, and freedom from the politics that had consumed his life. He was no longer merely one of 3 rulers of a fractured empire in Alexandria. He was a king beside a queen, and Cleopatra knew exactly how to make him feel that way. But beneath the glitter and music, this was more than seduction. Both needed something from the other. Cleopatra sought protection in Egypt. Independence had always hung by a thread, one Roman ambition away from extinction. Antony, meanwhile, needed money and ships for his looming campaign against the Parthians. Each saw in the other not only desire, but opportunity. As the banquet ended, the line between pleasure and politics dissolved completely. Antony was no longer the interrogator, Cleopatra no longer the accused. They had become partners in ambition and soon in something far more dangerous. In the candlelight of that Egyptian night, empire and emotion began to blur. By the time Antony followed Cleopatra to Alexandria, their bond had become the most talked about scandal in the ancient world. What had begun as an affair of diplomacy had transformed into a partnership of passion and politics, and it was impossible to tell which was more perilous. In the marble palaces of Alexandria, Antony found a life Rome could never give him: luxury without limits, love without restraint, and power that felt divine. Cleopatra, however, was not lost in romance. She was calculating as any ruler surrounded by Roman ambition had to be. She understood Antony's weaknesses, his pride, his vanity, his hunger for adoration, and she fed them skillfully. In Egypt, he was not the weary general battling the Senate's whispers. He was Dionysus, reborn, the god of wine, ecstasy, and victory. Cleopatra encouraged the illusion because it served them both. Their court became legendary, a world of silk, poetry, and intoxication. They founded the inimitable Livers, a private society devoted to pleasure and excess. Every night was a feast of laughter, music, and wine that seemed never to run dry. They would roam the streets of Alexandria in disguise, playing pranks on unsuspecting citizens. The general who had once commanded legions now tossed fish into market stalls with his queen, delighting in the chaos. But the laughter masked a sharper truth. Behind every flirtation lay a treaty. Behind every kiss, a calculation. Cleopatra needed Antony to secure her throne and the future of her son. Caesarion, the boy she claimed, was Julius Caesar's heir. Antony, in turn, needed Egypt's gold to fund his armies and cement his authority in the East. Together, they became a political machine disguised as a love story. Back in Rome, the Senate seethed. Rumors of Antony's debauchery spread like wildfire. Stories claimed he had abandoned Roman virtue to live as Cleopatra's puppet, a man bewitched by a foreign queen. The image of him wearing Egyptian robes, drinking from golden goblets, and calling himself a god shocked Romans to their core. Yet, in Alexandria, none of that mattered. For a fleeting moment, they ruled the world as lovers and sovereigns, two stars, burning too brightly to last. But even stars, no matter how brilliant, eventually collapse under their own gravity. While Antony and Cleopatra reveled in the splendor of Alexandria, Rome simmered with outrage. The once great general who had stood beside Julius Caesar was now painted as a man enslaved by luxury and lust, the plaything of an Eastern temptress. And no one exploited that image better than Gaius Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and Antony's political rival. Octavian understood propaganda as a modern strategist understands media. He didn't need to defeat Antony on the battlefield yet. He would destroy him first in the minds of the Roman people. Pamphlets, speeches, and whispered rumors recast Antony as the villain of a national drama. He was accused of dressing as an Egyptian, calling himself the new Dionysus, and bowing to Cleopatra as if she were a goddess to Rome. That wasn't romance, it was treason wrapped in perfume. Cleopatra and Antony continued to blur the line between passion and politics. Together, they envisioned an empire united between East and West, a revival of Alexander's dream. Cleopatra sought to restore Egypt's former glory. Antony wanted to carve his own dynasty beyond Rome's reach to cement this alliance. Antony publicly recognized Cleopatra's children, including Caesarion, as rulers of the eastern territories. The gesture infuriated Octavian. In Roman eyes, Antony had not only betrayed his country, but insulted Caesar's legacy by elevating a foreign heir over him. The rift widened when Antony's Roman wife, Octavian's own sister, tempted to reconcile the two men. Antony refused her, sending her back humiliated. It was a fatal mistake. Octavian now had both personal and political ammunition. He spread stories that Cleopatra had bewitched Antony, that she used dark magic to enslave his will. To the Roman masses, this was irresistible gossip. In truth, Antony wasn't bewitched. He was simply blind to how deeply the tide had turned. While he and Cleopatra dined beneath silver ceilings, Rome was being prepared for holy war, not against Parthia or any foreign enemy, but against its own general. Love, once their greatest strength, had become Octavian's sharpest weapon. But Octavian saw opportunity. He obtained Antony's will, possibly stolen from the temple of the Vestal Virgins, and read it aloud before the Senate. In it, Antony allegedly wished to be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria, not in Rome. Whether genuine or forged hardly mattered. The reaction was outrage. The Republic's patience snapped from that moment. The affair was no longer a scandal. It was war. Rome would not forgive a general who called himself a god beside a queen who claimed divinity. Cleopatra had dreamed of an empire reborn. Antony dreamed of freedom from Rome's chains. Instead, their union had painted a single target on both their crowns. Love and politics had become indistinguishably. Now both would lead them to ruin. By 32 BCE, Rome was done whispering. The Senate declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke by Octavian, framing the conflict as a holy crusade against a foreign queen, made Antony's Roman supporters appear traitorous, and allowed Octavian to pose as the defender of Roman virtue. The love story of Antony and Cleopatra had become the justification for an empire-wide war. Antony's forces rallied in the east. He commanded vast legions and an impressive fleet, bolstered by Cleopatra's Egyptian navy and endless treasure. Together, they prepared for confrontation along the Ionian coast. In Alexandria, Cleopatra oversaw the arming of ships, while priests blessed the war banners. Antony, meanwhile, sank into a grim mixture of determination and denial. He knew Octavian's propaganda had poisoned Rome against him, but he believed victory could silence the critics. Octavian, however, was no soldier in shining armor. He was a strategist of reputation. His general, Marcus Agrippa, took the battlefield lead, seizing key ports and cutting off Antony's supply lines. The propaganda machine never ceased. Rome was flooded with images of Cleopatra as a seductive sorceress, riding Antony like a puppet. Even the gods, it seemed, had turned their favor toward Octavian. Antony, and Cleopatra's forces finally assembled at Actium on the western coast of Greece. It was a poor choice: narrow waters, unpredictable winds, and a fleet burdened with oversized Egyptian galleys. Many of Antony's officers urged retreat to Egypt, but pride chained him to the fight. To abandon now would mean conceding not just the war, but his legend. As the armies faced each other across the Ionian Sea, tension gripped both camps. Cleopatra walked among her soldiers, dressed in armor beneath her royal cloak, urging courage. Antony promised victory and revenge, but beneath their speeches, fear rippled. Their armies were vast, but their unity fragile. Mercenaries fought for pay, not loyalty, and supplies ran dangerously low. The final battle was approaching, and neither love nor gold could delay it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide not only who ruled Rome, but whether history would remember Antony and Cleopatra as conquerors or as lovers who destroyed themselves. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, the Ionian Sea shimmered under a pitiless sun. Across the waters near Actium, two worlds stared each other down. On one side stood Octavian's disciplined legions, and the brilliant Admiral Agrippa on the other. The glittering but uneasy alliance of Mark, Antony, and Cleopatra, their fleets anchored in a crescent formation laden with Egyptian treasure, ambition, and fate. Antony's ships were magnificent but unwieldy, massive galleys, armed like floating fortresses. Cleopatra's fleet lighter and faster lingered near the rear, her royal standard fluttering over a golden vessel. On land, thousands of soldiers waited for the signal that would decide the future of the Mediterranean. As the battle began, the sea filled with the roar of rams and the thunder of catapults. Smoke swallowed the horizon. Agrippa's smaller, more agile ships darted through the chaos, striking the cumbersome Egyptian vessels and vanishing before they could retaliate. Antony's line began to falter. Confusion spread. The wind shifted. Sails tangled. Orders clashed. Then came the moment that would haunt history. Cleopatra's fleet suddenly broke formation and turned south, retreating toward the open sea. Whether this was a planned maneuver or panic, no one truly knows. Seeing her royal banner vanish into the horizon, Antony made his fatal choice. He abandoned command, boarded a smaller ship, and chased after her. His men watched in disbelief as their commander, the conqueror of Parthia, the hero of Rome, sailed away for love. Without their leader, Antony's fleet collapsed. Agrippa's forces closed in, burning and boarding the remaining ships. The once mighty armada was reduced to smoke and splintered wood. Antony caught up to Cleopatra's fleeing flagship hours later. The two reportedly sat in silence as the sea behind them turned black with fire. In that moment, they both understood what they had done: not just lost a battle, but surrendered an empire. Back in Rome, Octavian declared victory. He presented the war as divine justice, reason defeating decadence, virtue triumphing over corruption. But in truth, it was something far more human: ambition defeating love. The Battle of Actium was not merely a clash of fleets. It was the end of an age and the beginning of legend. The defeat at Actium was the beginning of the end. Antony and Cleopatra fled across the Mediterranean. When they returned to Alexandria, the city greeted them not with cheers, but with dread. The once golden couple had become symbols of ruin. Their fleet was gone. Their allies had deserted them. and Octavian was marching east with an army that would not stop until Egypt bowed. Cleopatra retreated into her palace, surrounding herself with treasures and loyal guards as if walls of gold could delay reality. She began preparing her mausoleum not as a monument to vanity, but as a final refuge. Antony, meanwhile, sank into despair. The soldier who had once ruled half the known world now spent his days drinking and brooding among statues of gods that no longer listened. In 30 BCE, Octavian's legions reached Alexandria. His propaganda had done its work. Many of Antony's officers defected before the fighting even began. In a last act of defiance, Antony led his remaining troops in a doomed counterattack near the city gates. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, his army disintegrated. The war was over before it began. Rumor soon reached Antony that Cleopatra was dead, that she had taken her own life to avoid capture. Shattered, he fell upon his sword. The blade did not kill him immediately. Mortally wounded, he ordered his servants to carry him to her tomb when the doors opened. Cleopatra was alive, pale, weeping, and furious at the lie that had doomed him. As he bled out in her arms, Antony gasped his final words, urging her to make peace with Octavian. Then the great general, the man who had conquered empires and lost everything for love, died. Cleopatra received him dressed in her finest regalia, her composure flawless even in defeat. She tried once more to charm Rome's new master, but Octavian was made of colder stone. He wanted her alive as a trophy for his triumph in Rome. Cleopatra understood the humiliation that awaited her. She would not survive it. As Octavian secured Egypt for Rome, the queen prepared for her final act. The stage was set for one of history's most haunting farewells. Cleopatra had ruled for 21 years, outwitted generals, seduced emperors, and defied the most powerful empire on earth. But now, in the summer of 30 BCE, her empire was gone. Octavian's soldiers patrolled the streets of Alexandria. Her ships lay burned in the harbor, and her lover's body had already been buried with Roman honors. All that remained was her pride, and she guarded that more fiercely than any throne. Octavian, cold and deliberate, wanted her alive. In Rome, her capture would be his ultimate victory, a living symbol of Egypt's fall, paraded through the streets in chains. But Cleopatra understood spectacle better than anyone. She would not let her life end as another man's triumph. If she could not rule as a goddess, she would die as one. Confined to her mausoleum, she began to prepare. She bathed, dined, and dressed as though for coronation, not execution. Her servants adorned her in royal gold, braided her hair, and perfumed her hands. In her final hours, she received Octavian's envoys with calm defiance, assuring them she had no intention of harming herself, even as her eyes lingered on a small woven basket brought to her chambers. Disguised as a gift of figs, when Octavian's guards returned, they found her lifeless, lying upon a golden couch in her imperial robes. Two of her attendants, Iras and Charmian, were dead beside her. Faint puncture marks showed on Cleopatra's arm, the sacred asp, its fatal kiss. News of her death spread like wildfire. Octavian was furious. She had denied him his victory. Yet even he could not help but admire her final performance. Cleopatra had robbed Rome of its spectacle and secured her legacy in one elegant gesture. She was buried beside Antony. just as she had wished united in death as in defiance. With their deaths, Egypt's independence ended. Octavian became Augustus Rome's first emperor, and the age of republics gave way to empire. But the legend of Antony and Cleopatra refused to die. For centuries, poets, painters, and playwrights would return to their story, to lovers who turned politics into passion, and passion into myth. Their empire crumbled, but their names became immortal.